Well, hey, CNFers, we're less than 2 months away from the publication of The Front Runner. So be sure you secure yourself a pre-order. While supplies last, call now. But seriously, go to your bookseller of choice and maybe pre-order it. Also, it's getting close to the next live taping of the podcast. If you're in Eugene, Sunday, April 13th at 1 p.m., at Gratitude Brewing, I'll be interviewing Leah Satilli about Blazing Eye Sees All. Love has won false prophets in the fever dream of the American New Age. It's her latest book. It's amazing. Dig it.
For me, it was like this record scratch moment where it's just like, what? Wait a second, hold on. We moved from that way too fast.
OAC Nevers, it's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Show where I speak to tellers of true tales. About the true tales they tell. I'm your host, Brendan O'Mara. Don't leave. Don't leave. It's that Atavistian time of the month. So there are some spoilers here. The Balloon That Fell from the Sky is authored by Nick Davidson, a writer and journalist based out of Santa Fe, New Mexico, which might be named New America if this administration continues to torch the Constitution and any and all human decency. 15 teams lifted off from Switzerland in gas ballooning's most audacious race. 3 days later, 2 of them drifted into Belarusian space, but only one would survive. Shit. I'm attending my first protest tomorrow, that Hands Off 2025. Got one in Eugene from 12 to 3 on Saturday. I was thinking of making an Elon Musk sign that instead of his tech support shirt, it says, like, Nazi support. Anyway, Nick Davidson can be seen at nickgdavidson.com. He knows how to play an almighty riff. He's a storyteller, outdoorsman, traveler, martial artist, yogi, musician. His stories tend to live at the outdoorsy crossroads of adventure, the natural world, and the human condition. Good eats. Show notes of this episode or more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey, there. You can read hot blogs and sign up for the monthly Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. I'm getting more and more ragey, CNFers. So if you want book recommendations, cool links, and good cheer, sign up. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. There's now a weekly companion Podstack at creativenonfictionpodcast.substack.com. If you want the transcripts and the text of the potting shot, deep dives into the archives, this is the newsletter to enrichen your podcast experience. I thought more people might be into it, but it's really no big deal because I need to do the transcripts for the eventual CNF Pod book, and this holds me accountable. Whether 5 of you sign up or 5,000, I'd prefer 5K, but whatevs. Here's the thing. I'm also thinking of maybe just doing the transcript as I'll just link out to it in Dropbox. You can download it if you want. And instead of just having the full transcript in the Podstack, doing a more Maria Popovian old school brain pickings kind of riff where maybe I write 1,000 words with lots of quotes that shapes the conversation like a mini feature. That way the body of the Podstack isn't too long. But if you want the entire transcript, go download it. I might try that with this one. It's not going to come out the Friday. I got a lot going on. Might come out Monday. I don't know. Shout out to Kim Kelly for becoming a $4 patron. Kim was one of my letters to the editor writers when I was stewarding the sinking ship that was the Register Guard opinion page for 3 years. She always wrote concise, organized, and crystallized arguments in fewer than 200 words. So thank you, Kim, for this extra bit of support. And you, too, can support the pod by heading to patreon.com/CNFpod. Can you imagine if the pod made $2,000 a month through Patreon? That'd be cool. 1,900 more to go. Let's go. Let's go. Okay. First, we're going to hear from Jonah Ogles. You know him, the lead editor of this piece. Consider subscribing to the Atavist, magazine.atavist.com. I don't get kickbacks. I just piggyback on the audience. Ain't that cool? No parting shot this episode since things got a bit wordy. But rest assured, I will deliver a parting shot for the ages next week. Here's Jonah. Riff.
You need to be a truffle pig.
But, it was a machete brandished.
I almost always have a very specific reader in mind.
I know. I sometimes wish I would have never done any of these things.
This is going to have to interest somebody somewhere other than me.
just like in their own box. Or certainly that like editors, whatever editors are thinking and doing is just kind of its own thing in a separate space. So I'm glad to hear that it's helpful to hear kind of how we talk about stories and pitches.
Yeah, well, there's so much, be it book proposals or how gatekeepers are thinking. There's not a whole lot of conversation or transparency around that, so it can feel really isolating, and like you're constantly trying to crack a code. Like you're like a code breaker. Like, all right, I'm going to try it this way. And sure, there is a lot of trial and error involved with this, but it can be really frustrating when you can go for years sometimes not knowing maybe the best way to pitch or how much research you should be putting into a pitch, how much is too much or how much is too little, and so forth. So getting your inputs, I think, has been greatly helpful, certainly for me, but also for a lot of the listeners who are starting to now, as they pitch stories, think like you on the other side. And I think that's really just elevating the game of those pitches.
Good.
And speaking of that, let's launch into Nick's piece here. When this comes across your desk, what lit you up about the way Nick sold this piece to you?
Yeah, well, he had done a lot of reporting, and it showed in the pitch for sure. Yeah. It was clear that there was a high level of detail in the pitch. It read almost like the first section would. There was like color and dialogue and scenery, which always, you want to give enough of a sense of your writing is always helpful, because we know, okay, he kind of knows the type of thing we're doing, but it also shows that like he's done the work and he has the stuff to back it up. We get a lot of pitches where I'll even ask, like, have you talked to these people yet? Mm-hmm. Because it's just not really clear in the pitch. It might even be like a well-written pitch, but it's just not clear that they've actually talked to the main sources. And Nick had done the work and had a good sense of how he wanted to tell the story. And it was one of those that came in, and like even before we met in the meeting, I kind of knew we were going to assign it.
How much voice and style do you like seeing in a pitch?
I like it. I mean, like Nick and I actually had an early conversation where I politely asked if we could ban the word voice from our editing discussions, not because of anything he did. I find sometimes that the idea of voice can end up being kind of a distraction as you move through the editing process. But to your question, it's nice. Like I want it to feel pretty polished, whether that means it's super voicey or just really clean. It just needs to read like the story will ultimately read. And yeah, I am often telling writers who send in very brief pitches of like 200-300 words, I'll say to them, like, look, we are getting pitches that are like 1,500 words, 2,000 words, sometimes even like 3,000. We want it to read like the first section of a story, like get us hooked on these characters and the setting and on your writing. And then you can back up and tell us, here are the people I've talked to. Here's what I still have left to do. Here's how I see the story progressing from beginning to end. It's very helpful. When we get a pitch that's just like reads like the story, even if the idea is ultimately not for us, it immediately makes me go, okay, here's somebody who gets it.
Yeah.
And who I would like to work with.
With Nick's story, as you're having that dialogue and that back and forth of how to structure and pace out this story, what were some of the conversations you were having as you were generating, what became, just a really wonderful, rollicking piece?
Yeah, if I remember right, I don't think we talked too much about structure before the draft came in, which is fine. Some writers, I want help with an outline and they want to talk through structure, and I'm happy. That kind of developmental editing I find really fun. I enjoy it when it does happen, but if writers know how they want to do it, great. And so when I got the first draft of this story, I think the biggest challenge for us was there's the event itself. It's a gas ballooning race, and so there are like 15 competitors up in the air flying over Europe at the whims of the wind. And Nick's writing about ballooning was just like from the beginning great. Like it was evocative, and there were minor things that I didn't quite understand, but he really had a handle on the actual sport. But then there's this tragic accident, and following that, there are 2 or maybe even 3 competing investigations into what happened. I don't remember exactly how much of the story the discussion of those investigations took up, but it was a lot. It might have been 40 to 50% of the story, and all of it after the action had more or less concluded, so that was the biggest narrative issue that we had to work through. It was like, okay, it's absolutely important to understand what these entities said and caused the accident, and what this sort of counter investigation found, but we just can't devote 6,000 words to it. I often tell writers that, like, if you're like, I really don't like to be away from the narrative for much more than like 300 to 500 words, without like coming back to a character or something. But I think like 1,000 or 1,200 would be an absolute max to sort of, at least in an Atavist story, without coming back. So we just had to find a way to really condense that down, and I did some of it, and Nick did some of it, and I did some more, but ultimately we got those down to just what we absolutely needed to know. And then the piece was able to keep moving after that. We were able to like do a brief detour into this important thing, but then come back into the narrative without readers feeling like they'd been away for a long time,
Yeah, I remember when I was helping someone out with a project a few years ago, and in the piece, it was like you could start to feel you're like, not that things were boring, but you're like looking at your watch. You're like, all right, we're straying too far from like our main guy. Like we're hooked on like this guy being, as Lawrence Wright would say, the mule. Like we need that person, and you're like, this thing is going on forever. Like, well, all right, when's he coming back? When's he coming back?
Yeah.
And you get a sense of, after you're like in an Atavist piece, maybe 300, 500 words, you're like, okay, we're pushing up against the limit here.
Yeah. And it that can depend on what the detour is that you've taken in the story. Sometimes you need to kind of go off on a tangent for a little while, but you try to find the right place to do that. And I don't remember exactly what Nick and I did, but I think we did play a little bit with where to do that and what should immediately precede it and follow it, because you can use that to your benefit. If you've got a real cliffhanger of a section ending just before the tangent, I think you owe it to readers to come back to it relatively quickly, but I do think the cliffhanger buys you a little more time than just like leading into it with, something that there's not a lot of tension, there's not a lot of drama. I think you want something sort of hanging out there that readers really want to know and are eager to get back to.
When a first draft comes to you, which is pretty well polished, and when you're starting to, okay, this is going to be the marble that we're working with to hone to a nice statue, what are some common things that you notice in a first draft that typically need work across, the body of work you've edited?
In general, like the background and context tends to be a little longer than it needs to be. I think writers, as they get deep into the reporting process, if they're good, they've done a lot of background research, and they have all this material that might say something about the state of gas ballooning, or things like that there may not be a place for it in the narrative, but like within a character's arc, but they feel like it's really, it helped them understand things, and they can kind of lose sight. Now, I'm not blaming them. I think it's just natural that, okay, here it all is. Here's all this other stuff that I've learned and that I want to talk about. So we're often paring that stuff down. And then I'm usually also pressing, and this is maybe a little unique to Atavist stories, but I'm usually pressing for more scenes. I think especially for writers coming, if this is the first piece they've written that's maybe going to be published at longer than 4,000 words or 5,000 words, there is a little bit of an adjustment into how you pace things. And we just like more scenery, we want more dialogue. So easily one of my most common comments is more, I want to hear these people more, like get me closer to them, put me on their shoulder and let me really like inhabit this moment with them. I want to hear what they're thinking. I want to hear what they're saying, smell what they're smelling, just put it all out there and slow down on that stuff. So it's like slow down on all the all the drama and speed up on anything that's not that.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. When you were working with Nick on this piece and you said that his pitch was like very well reported, very well researched, just overall with the experience of this particular piece, what struck you about just Nick's talent as a writer or reporter? Like what really jumped out off of the experience with him from your perspective?
Yeah, his revision. I mean, his first revision, and like I told him, because Nick and I, we know each other. We lived in Santa Fe. I was there for whatever it was, 7-8 years. And we worked together at Outside, and and I really wanted this story to be amazing, and I really went hard on the first edit, and it was one of the few times I think I've even said, like, I'm sorry if this is harsh. Like, I don't mean for it to be harsh, and it's not a personal reflection. I am just really pushing on the story because I wanted it to be great. And there were some obvious fixes, I thought, or some things that were obvious to me that I thought would help. And man, his revision was like, it was so good. I mean, it was one of the best revisions I've ever gotten. And he did extra reporting. He went back to sources. He really he just took it seriously, Yeah. And sometimes I don't fault writers for this, but sometimes you feel like their revisions come in and it was just kind of like they wanted it off their plate as quickly as possible.
Yeah, just like accept change. And
yes, totally. Yeah, they put in the work on this long draft and they just want to okay, whatever, just keep it moving. But Nick really he went back to the table and did the work, and it showed. That second draft, it was not very different from the story we ultimately published. Just trimming and tightening a little bit, but his revision was solid.
What is the experience like for you when you're editing someone that you've known for a while, that you're probably very good friends with? How does that change the dynamic?
Yeah. I mean, it depends.
Yeah.
I've had it gone really wrong for me before. Mm-hmm. It's my feelings have been hurt. Their feelings have been hurt. The friendship has suffered.
That's all. I don't laugh because it's funny. I just laugh because it's just, I feel for you in that regard.
Well, yeah, and I feel for them. I do. I look back on some of those experiences and I'm just like, oh God, what a nightmare for them to have had to go through. And I think in most cases, it's fine. In some ways it's a little easier, because editing, I've edited my friend Will Grant a bunch, and read parts of his book that he ultimately wrote. And, we know each other well enough. I can be honest. I can say this, I didn't get this at all. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that's a little better than somebody I've never worked with who I'm worried about how sensitive they might be. Yeah. And I don't really like confrontation or conflict. So I might be well, I'm a little confused. Are we saying this? Are we saying that? and sometimes it could just be better to like cut straight through it. And in Nick's case, I think it only helped us because, we know each other. We know that we're both serious about the work and care most about the story. And so it allowed us to just really, well, I don't think I would have been quite as harsh with that first edit as I was if I didn't know him and know that he could handle it.
Awesome. Well, Jonah, this was really, really rich side of the table too for your experience with this incredible story that you and Nick brought across the finish line. So anyway, just always great to get your impressions, and just thanks for the time. And we'll kick it over to Nick right now.
All right. Thanks for having me, Brendan.
All right. That was great, wasn't it? I thought so. So Nick's work has appeared in Outside Magazine, The Atavist, Men's Journal, Garden and Gun. Stay tuned for Amanda Heckert at some point. She's in the can, executive editor or editor-in-chief, I don't know, of Garden and Gun. And High Country News, that's the other body of work for Nick. Backpacker, Sierra, Vice Sports, and Popular Science. You can find him on the gram at Nick G. Davidson. He has a dynamite beard, and this is a dynamite conversation. And really, stay through to the end. Like, it's a legit great conversation towards the end. Not that that doesn't discount or discredit everything that happened before, but like, it gains a whole nother level of altitude at the end that I think you're really going to dig. So here's Nick. Let's get after it. Huh.
First phone call to publication yesterday, and yet it's a story that, like my mom told me, okay, I'm going to start reading it, and then an hour later, I'm done. It was amazing. It's just funny that like something that's taken me so long to create, of course, as is, expected, can be consumed in an hour and a half. But so it's like this little bit of a surreal feeling, but really good to get some good response so far, and it's trickling in a good way, and just happy to see people enjoying it, finally.
And when you were researching the story, or even a step before that, how did this story get on your radar in the first place?
I'll start by saying, so I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and an hour south of here is Albuquerque, which is kind of like the balloon capital of the world, pretty much. There's an annual International Bloom Fiesta every October, and I've lived here for coming up on 15 years now, and so balloons in a way have really been in the air, to use a bad pun, and have just been in the zeitgeist here, and I've been aware of them for a long time. And then also weirdly, I grew up in a town in Indiana called Fishers, got right on the border of another town called Noblesville, and every year there was I don't even know if it was a race per se, but some kind of balloon event that every summer as a kid I'd look up and suddenly dozens of balloons would be in the air, and I would, recognize ones that I'd see year after year, and really enjoyed that, and kind of thought of it as this magical kind of whimsical adventure thing. So I didn't really think about it much, but I guess in a way balloons were kind of just like in my internal experience, somewhere lurking in my subconscious. And I thought, I came to Santa Fe originally to work with Outside Magazine, and so I was always thinking of really interesting adventure stories to tell, and at some point I thought I gotta find a good balloon story. There's got to be something good out there. It was early 2020, right before the pandemic. I was, as I've been doing for years, I was volunteering with the adaptive ski program up at Ski Santa Fe. And one day after our lessons, a group of other instructors and I went up to this mid-mountain bar called Totem Offs, got a drink to end the day, and on the wall behind the person across from me was this really interesting poster that I don't know if I'd never seen it, I'd never noticed it before, but it was a poster about some kind of balloon accomplishment or race, and it mentioned something about the first transatlantic balloon crossing and trans-Pacific balloon crossing. And it turned out that the person who had done both of these things was he's no longer alive, but was the original owner of Ski Santa Fe. And his grandson, I believe, still runs it today. So a family-run ski hill, and I was like, I didn't even know that this internationally known, respected balloon family lived in Santa Fe or Albuquerque, I think. And so I kind of started digging into it, and originally I thought maybe I was going to be doing some sort of like multi-generational balloon family adventure kind of thing, because as it turns out, Ben Abruzzo Sr.'s son, Richard Abruzzo, is also a well-known and respected balloonist who tragically lost his life in the Gordon Bennett race in 2010, I believe. And yeah, I just thought like there's something interesting with this balloon family, and talked to a few people, dug into it a little bit. And as I was digging, I found randomly it was like a 1990s New York Times article that just had this really kind of wild, almost surreal throwaway line that, like, in the midst of whatever it was about, it said something almost casually like, the Belarusian military shot down a balloon in the midst of this prestigious international race. And for me, it was like this record scratch moment where it's just like, what? Wait a second, hold on. We moved from that way too fast. And it turned out that there wasn't really a lot about it. I mean, I looked for a while and found, in the, week or two following this incident in 1995, there was definitely a lot of press, and even in the New York Times and a bunch of local newspapers, international newspapers, but there wasn't much to it. And I just thought, like, no one else has apparently dug into this story, and I just wanted to know more. And one of my guiding principles is if I want to know more, if I'm hooked, if I'm intrigued, then I know other people are going to be intrigued too.
What you said a moment ago really underscores what it means to be like a long form or narrative journalist. So like they moved on from that way too fast. And therein lies like oftentimes when your spidey sense tingles, and it's kind of like, all right, there's probably a full-fledged story here, and I got to lean into this for a bit more.
Yeah, that's one thing that I kind of look at. I mean, I'm always just keeping my eyes open, my heart open to kind of just, and I really believe in paying attention to my intuition. So like I come across lines like that and I let it stop me. And if the gears are turning and I want to know more, sometimes it doesn't always go anywhere, but a lot of times I find that like, there's definitely a story to be told there. The question is, how much is there? How much can I find? Who can I contact? What kind of access is there? And then am I the person to tell it? Like, do I want to invest in this? But yeah, I'm always just kind of keeping my eyes out for these little nuggets. And whenever some little light bulb goes off in my head, I know at least I need to look more.
So when you come across a story like that and you're like, there's more here, and you're following your intuition, what is the first step from there for you?
First step for me is probably just some basic online digging, some Googling, seeing what's out there. I mean, a lot of times actually my question is, has someone else done this before? Because, you can catch those little lines and think, oh my God, this is a great story. And then you're like, yeah, well, so a lot of other people thought that too, and they wrote books about it. And so maybe I won't do that one. I think if there is a fresh perspective, if someone has already told a version of a story, but there's something new to say or some new insight, I think it can be worth pursuing. But I generally am most interested in finding and telling stories that someone really hasn't dug into that much, or, maybe only shed light on a portion of it. I'll dig around, just see what if anything's been written about it. If I feel like I'm in the clear, then, I just follow my curiosity, really. I don't have a really solid strategy that, like I check all the boxes, but I kind of just meander and trust my curiosity, follow the crumbs, so to speak, and kind of watch this picture unfold. And if I really feel like this is a story I want to know more about, then I'll find out who to talk to, and I'll track them down. As a freelance writer, you get pretty good at figuring out how to get in touch with somebody. And in a story like this, I think as with many stories, but this story took place now 30 years ago. So it was, not exactly pre-internet, but pre-internet being like the center of everyone's life.
Mm-hmm.
And so the way this one worked was I found like one or two people that were at or near the center of this web of interconnected people in this ballooning community. And as soon as I talked to one person and learned what I could from them, I would have them connect me to other people. And, the more people you talk to, the more the story opens up. The story begins to reveal itself. And you just keep tugging on those threads and letting the picture take shape, and kind of you're learning the story as you go.
And as you're formulating the pitch for a story like this, and as a freelance writer, so much of that upfront research it's very much unpaid, and you're investing a lot of time in these things for something that might not be a certainty, but you do have to put a lot of meat on that bone for it to even be the least bit appetizing for an editor, an Atavist in this case. So how much are you typically investing upfront in that research to make sure the pitch is as cracking as possible?
That's a good question. I kind of just intuit where I need to stop.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if I don't stop myself, I'll just keep going. And as I said earlier, I really do trust that if I am grabbed by a story, then, number one, a lot of readers are going to be too, but other editors will be, other publications will be. So I really put a lot of trust in my own instincts, and to a certain extent, I just know, like, if I'm digging into this story and I am finding stuff and I am getting access and the documents materialize and all of that, in a way, I don't really worry about whether or not it will pan out. I just kind of start figuring out how it's going to pan out, who's the right person to pitch, who's the right publication, because it's really just a matter of finding that match. And pitching is weird because, like, maybe an editor is having a bad day, maybe the publication is already doing a similar story, something like that. So you can't ever really be sure. But I don't know if I could put a percent on it, but I do enough to make sure of a couple of things. One is that there is a story that will unfold in front of me, and I have access to the people and the documents that will, reveal that story to me. And even if I haven't talked to all those people or seen all those documents, I know that they're there. I know that I can get to them. And then the other thing, well, kind of related to that, is just that I want to be able to show that I have talked to some people. So, like, it's not enough to say, I read this weird line on a New York Times story and I think it'll be great. How about we do it? That's not enough. You have to show that you've invested enough into it. And so I'm at least doing a couple of interviews with the central characters so that I can include quotes in the pitch. I really like to write scenery. Like, my pitches, I think my strategy, these days for the last several years has been making sure that I actually can write a scene, partly to show what my writing is like, partly to show that I have a scene, then I can write that. After I write that scene, then I tell the editor, okay, there's a glimpse of this story that you're going to get. First of all, don't you want to know more? Because I do. And then saying, here's my plan for reporting. Here's who else I need to contact. Here's what I know. Here are the things that I expect. This is you can't really fully know how a story is going to unfold when you haven't done all of the reporting, but you can say, here's kind of what I expect to find out. And here's, as I understand it, the basic arc of the story. And if you can convey those things and then you combine that with a little bit of luck, timing, and the right publication and editor, then I think you're pretty solid.
Yeah, that's really helpful. another thing too, when you're having these pre-reporting or preliminary conversations with central figures, as a freelancer, it's particularly thorny in that you're talking to them and you're like, well, I hope to land this story somewhere. So you're like, there's no certainty yet when you're like petitioning them to spend some time with you. And how do you navigate those conversations when you're like, yeah, I want to report the story out, but like, I don't have a publication for this yet, but like, trust me, I'm working on it.
Right. Well, there is a little bit of that trust. I mean, I found this isn't true for everyone, but I found that generally speaking, people want to tell their story, so you don't have to convince them too much. I mean, maybe some people aren't game for the amount of time you're going to ask of them, but starting out, like when you haven't done a long form story before, that can be a little hard. But especially now that I have some of that under my belt, like when I email people or sometimes cold call them, I say, here's who I am. And then I link to other stories that I've done, so I can say, I know this is, for one thing, it's going to take a lot of your time. It's also potentially involving things that are maybe hard memories for you to talk about, and maybe you're a little skeptical of sharing those. And I never press people on that from the get-go, because I don't want to feel entitled to tell someone else's story, but I do ask them for that opening and ask them for that trust, and let them know that I care about the story, I care about them and how they feel, and that I always say, I'm going to follow your lead, basically. If there's ever any point where you don't want to talk to me or about this particular element of the story, we can pause on that. So I just tell them, like, I'm going to take this at your pace, and show them other stories where I've done similar kinds of things, so they can see how I deal with that on the page. And like I said, people tend to want to tell their stories, so I've nearly universally had success in that, aside from very rare cases.
Yeah, and this story, because it took place, a few decades ago, and it's very kinetic and scene-driven, and a lot of that you weren't there, so it's all through recreation and reporting. So when you're building scenes, recreating scenes, how best do you go about that?
I'm a very visual person in my imagination, so as I'm talking to people, especially when they start telling me about a scene, that whether I expected this scene or whether it's just some gem that I had no idea about, when they're telling me, I'm really seeing it in my head, and I'm kind of letting it unfold as this mind movie, where like I might add some details here and there in my own brain, which of course, later you got to fact check that stuff. But so I really see a scene come to life when I'm talking to people about it. And then especially when you have a scene that involves multiple people, you talk to all of those people and you kind of triangulate what everything looked and felt and smelled like. But also when I reach that point and I know that this scene is going to be in the story, I really try to get the person to see what I'm seeing, but from their more expert viewpoint. And I ask them to describe things to me, and I say, like I know this is a weird level of detail, like I get it, but what did the air smell like? What was the weather? Was it cloudy that day? Do you remember the tone of voice someone said this to you in? And I even asked them directly I say, okay, tell me everything you can about this scene and tell it to me like you're watching a movie. Because that's how I want the scene to feel. Like, not that cinema is like the pinnacle of scene necessarily, but it's very vivid in its imagery and its sound, and you can't get the smells in there. But I think it's a really good way to get people to think really visually and in a multisensory way about the thing that they experienced 30 years ago, which, some of them are like, dude, this happened 30 years ago. I don't remember. And I said, I know, but try.
I know.
Like, just tell me anything you can think of.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just getting them to kind of open up in that way.
I can totally relate. Yeah, it's sometimes they're like, dude, like, why are you asking me this? I'm like, yeah, it's all in favor. Like, I'm like, if I was there right beside you as a bird on your shoulder, like, I wouldn't be asking this. I'd just be scribbling all these details down. But since I wasn't there, like, I need you to be the eyes, ears, and nose for me. I need you to fill up the senses for me, man.
Exactly.
And I know for me, so things that I tend to struggle with as on the reporting side of things, like I'm not particularly a fan of cold calling. I don't like it. It makes me nervous. I'm not a very good public records person. Like, I'm just not super savvy in that regard. There's a laundry list of things that I'm insecure about when it comes to this. But I wonder for you, like, what like what do you struggle with? What are the things that that sometimes give you pause? You're like, this is a heavier lift for me than this other thing.
There's an essay by Ray Bradbury from which I took a title for my college column. I wrote a weekly column, or bi-weekly, and it was called Driving Blind. So I feel a little bit like that's what I'm doing all the time, kind of driving blind and trusting. Things that are difficult for me, I really don't like cold calling either, mainly because there's that awkward, like, 30 seconds where you're just like, hey, don't hang up. Yeah. Here's who I am. Here's what I'm trying to do. Like, I know you don't get it. But also I try, if I can, to deal with that by when I've talked to other people and those people give me someone's number, say this person doesn't really do email or doesn't have an email address. Usually they'll talk to each other in the background behind the scenes. So typically people expect me, but I kind of, in terms of public records and stuff, I also, it's not like I ever took a class on it or anything. So I kind of just figure it out as I go. And I've had pretty good luck with that, but I don't know. Again, it's just trusting. Like, there's stuff that I'm going to stumble on. And the thing is, it's different for every story.
Yeah.
I think I can't remember who said this, but I think there was a novelist who was probably had several novels under their belt and was writing another one. They're just like, every time you start a new novel, you don't know what the hell you're doing. You're just starting fresh. Like, you would think that having the other things under your belt would help you, but it doesn't necessarily, because each story is its own thing. It brings about its own obstacles, its own needs. It has its own idiosyncrasies. Who you are in that moment is different from who you are telling a different story. So you really have to just open yourself to the story and kind of see what obstacles it's putting in front of you and figuring out your way around them, or conceding the loss when you can't. When you can't get a certain thread, you're pulling a thread and it's not coming, or it just it ends and separates from the entire tapestry.
Yeah, when this past weekend with Susan Orlean echoed exactly what you were saying. Like, she's written a bunch of books. She's been on the show, of course, a few times, and you would think you would have that, having written those books, it would make writing forthcoming ones and long articles easier, but it doesn't, to your point. And her big thing is, and I think this is true, if you've done it enough, the only thing that you do carry from one project to the next is like, all right, I've been here before, I felt this before, and I finished before. That's about it. And then that gives you the confidence to at least proceed in the face of unwavering uncertainty and certainly insecurity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really just a matter of, the first time you do anything, it's just like, can I do this? Yeah. Is this possible? I don't even know what's in my tool belt, let alone how to use it. But as you go along, what you really have is you have those tools and you have the expertise to use them. And, so I've also been like mostly a lifelong martial artist, and there's just a lot of foundational skills you have, like you learn how to do a kick or a punch or a throw or joint lock or something. And, when it comes to, say, sparring or just like kind of a self-defense situation, you don't know the outcome, but you know that you have the tools to use. And I kind of feel like, writing is less physically threatening, but it's got its own obstacles too. And you know that you have the confidence that you have the tools, you have the confidence that you can finish something, even when you start hyperventilating about it. You just take some breaths and get through it.
When I was speaking with Jonah, and I asked him, just on his side of the table, like what it's, from the first draft and what needs to be worked on, and then that gap between first draft, second draft, and revision. And he said that working with you here, and you guys have worked together in the past, was one of the best pure revisions that he had ever come across, from that first draft to the second one, and really commended you on just the way you leaned into that revision part. So when you're thinking of revision and the rewrites, just what is your headspace as you approach that next phase, very important phase of a long article?
Well, first I just have to say thanks to Jonah for saying that. That's really nice. And I should say that Jonah is a masterful editor. He's so good at what he does, so smart, and just really insightful and kind of incisive about knowing exactly what to do with a piece. And it kind of just starts with, for one thing, the story, right? You've spent a lot of time with it. You know all the elements that you've brought to it. Some things that maybe you left out. And Jonah was really, really good about being clear about what this story needed. So there was actually a draft that he didn't see. I don't think he might have seen it. But so I initially was working with Sayward, and the first draft I sent her after a mad frenzy of weeks of just pouring words out of me. I think I gave her a draft of it was over 19,000 words. And I was like, here you go. Sorry, I'm off to Asia for a couple months. And honestly, I haven't even told Sayward or Jonah this, but I didn't even actually read that draft from front to back. Like, I wrote it, so I read all of it, but I never sat down and read it all the way through. And so I think probably the only people who did were Sayward and my wife. So I don't think Jonah saw it. And I ended up kind of in the back of the queue, and some months later, Sayward came back to me and just said, well, just cut 5,000 words and then get back to me. and so I did. And I think that's the version that Jonah came to when we started working together. And he had several things to tell me, but I think the most crucial piece of advice or directive that he gave me was just like a lot more quotes. Like, we need more quotes, because for whatever reason, I was hesitant to have a lot of quotes in it, and I was just sort of narrating from this like kind of above, distanced remove. And I think that I had resisted writing any quotes that weren't in that chronological time frame, that didn't come from 1995 or 1996. Like, I don't know why, but I just didn't feel like I wanted to have quotes that obviously came from the modern day reflecting on that time. Mm-hmm. And that was just kind of silly, and Jonah got me over that. And so once he was just like, a lot more quotes, we need to get really close to these characters and feel the emotional journey that they're having, in addition to this physical one that I was describing. So I really took that to heart, and I was like, all right, do you want some quotes? I'm going to give you way more quotes than we need. And knowing that, we would cut ones that weren't necessary. But so I really took that to heart, added a lot of quotes that I think helped. And he was also, one of the other things he said, it was just like, I think at that point the story was 14,500 words. He's like, I don't know if this needs to be any longer than about 10,000. So just keep cutting everywhere you can. And I was also, it definitely took a lot of thought, and times it was hard, but I was kind of merciless in just cutting in whole entire sections and chunks out of that draft. Things that were more tangential threads that I liked, and, in a bigger, longer version of this story, say a book, it would be relevant. But he helped me really think about keeping the pace fast and moving forward and drawing the reader forward at all times and kind of leaning into it. So I just kind of went with it. I guess, it was a combination of knowing my story well and having really good editorial direction.
What was the biggest challenge for you in writing and reporting this piece out?
There were a few things. One was just, there was some documentation in the sense that there was a whole investigation and report on this balloon shoot down. And it's like an 81-page report led by a Russian, translated by the State Department. So I had access to that. I had access to a bunch of responses to this report and things that people had written in the aftermath of this tragedy that I could read. But most of the, kind of the central experience of the main protagonists of this story, Mike Wallace and Kevin Brielman, and their chase crew, Annetta Hochler, Vic Frankel, and Martin Sturzlinger, I was all really coming from their memory. So, and given that this was 30 years ago, as I said, like a lot of people, I was really just pulling details out of them and asking so much of them. And what I found occasionally challenging was the fact that, people would remember things differently, or there would just be holes in one person's memory and maybe another person would fill it out, and kind of trying to, again, sort of triangulate what actually happened and, what's the real likeliest version of the story or likeliest fact here, and really making those experiences come to life without any other documentation other than people's memories and things they were telling me. That was a little difficult at times. I mean, probably the hardest part of the story for me to write was the aftermath. When I got into, so the balloon had been shot down, a couple of people were held in military detention, the chase crew is racing to get them out of Belarus. Like all of those actions were pretty straightforward. But once the investigation had been done and the report came out and the whole ballooning community was responding to this report and arguing about it and feeling like it was like there was a cover up and there was a lot of things omitted from the report. There were inaccuracies. There was just things that offended people. There was this whole like saga almost where Mike Wallace and Kevin Brielman, went to the National Aeronautic Association and basically like demanded that Belarus be barred from all competition around the world for 5 years and all these things. Like there was just this whole segment that I didn't really know how to write because I had so much information, and I had basically, as I think I said earlier, like I was reporting a magazine story, but it kind of ended up being, in terms of what I got, like I got a book's worth of stuff. And so it's figuring out what to put in that was interesting and engaging, what to leave out so that it was also, still clear what happened and I could tell the story. And that was why my first draft was so long, I think, is that I really got into the weeds with the investigation and the counter response and all of that from the ballooning community. And I really relied on Jonah a lot, actually, for cutting that down and helping me understand what's interesting. Because I'm like, hey, I mean, everything's interesting to me, right? Mm-hmm. So what do you want to read? Like, if you're not me, like I need some distance from this. What do you want to read? So I think those were some of the most difficult things for me, is kind of parsing it down into like the most crucial elements of the story.
And so when you're in rewriting and revisions, what do you like to have in place so you can get a good sense of where the story's going?
Well, I think one thing that is important to say that might be a little different for me than some other Atavist writers is I think I had maybe something like 5 months between when I filed my first draft with Sayward and then I did kind of cut it down, but there was a decent chunk. It was like maybe even 7 or 8 months to the time where I did a rewrite for Jonah. And so there was a big gap there. And, the story was in me. The story is always living in me in that time too, knowing that I would have to work with it. But especially given that gap, I really, in addition to obviously rereading what I had written, I took the time to go back over all of my notes, and I do this before I do my first draft too, but I had organized all of my notes, all the transcripts and everything into kind of thematic chunks, or chunks that dealt with specific people, specific parts of the story. And I kind of went over those. I went over my outline that I had given to Sayward, and she took notes on that, or gave me notes back on that. And so I kind of just went through everything. And in some cases, I ended up checking in with people, because one of my big tasks in the main rewrite was adding quotes. And I did have a lot of quotes ready to use from my initial interviews, but I just kind of checked back in with people to refresh some things and get a little bit of new information. The track of the story, the overall arc of the narrative, didn't really shift all that much. I did move around things a little bit here and there, and took one piece that was kind of 2/3 of the way through and made that my ending. But other than that, like the vision really held through all the way. And so I was mainly just kind of mercilessly cutting things that I felt and that Jonah felt maybe wouldn't be suited to this particular version of the story. And I went through and kind of just really considered, what is the meat of this story? What is its core? Where do we really want to follow, and not divert readers on these other tangents that frankly are really fascinating. And some of these were scenes that I loved, some of my favorite ones. There was a lot of that extra material that I had to cut back on. And kind of the way that I approached that was, I had so much material. I really kind of accidentally, maybe subconsciously on purpose, was reporting essentially a book, and now I'm writing a magazine story. And so every time I cut a big chunk, I would say, okay, that's for the book, so no worries. It was really, really easy to cut that out. But yeah, other than that, again, there wasn't like a specific organized preconceived strategy. I kind of I went with the story that I knew. I really believe in learning your story and really listening to it and courting it almost, so that there's really this deep relationship between storyteller and story, so that as you're honing it, as you're carving chunks away, maybe adding pieces here and there, you already know it. It's living within you. The story is alive, and you're responding to it. You're responding to its needs because you've learned it, you've listened to it. And it was just a continuation of that process, and taking Jonah's really excellent notes and taking them to heart and just really going for it. And it kind of reminds me of that story of Michelangelo and the statue of David. I'm sure you've heard this. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but someone asked him, like, how did you create this amazing, beautiful piece of artwork? It's just appears to be flawless, and it's just so alive and human. He said, well, I started with a chunk of marble, and I just took away everything that wasn't David. And that's kind of how I approached the story too, is, what are the parts that aren't this story in this telling?
Yeah, at the heart of the story too is, this tragic event of this balloon being shot down. And inherent in journalism, as you've been in this long enough too, things can feel sometimes exploitative or an extraction-y. I was wrestling with that with the Prefontaine book. And I just wonder, for you as a reporter, here we are. Here are these elements central to the story that are tragic, and we're reliving trauma for some people, and then we're aiming to craft something that is informative but also artistic and entertaining. And at the heart of that are these real people, and then our name is on the story, and in a way it advances our career, and we're kind of benefiting from that. And I've thought about that a lot in the last couple years. Certainly over the last 20, but definitely the last 2 years has really struck me. And I just wonder, for you, how do you wrangle with that or dance with that feeling?
I know that inherently storytelling, especially journalism, where you're telling other people's stories that you're not involved in, it's inherently a little bit exploitative and a little bit of voyeurism. And you kind of just have to accept that. But as I think I said before, I make sure that I let the people whose story this is take the lead. And I really work to make sure that they trust me and that I'm not flippant about their emotional experience. And, I let them guide the conversation. I mean, when I approach an interview, I honestly don't really even think of it or call it an interview. It's just a conversation. And I might write down questions that I know I want the answers to eventually, but I'm not really, I hardly even consult that, and I'm certainly not reading off this list. So I just start talking human to human. That's the thing, is you have to remember that, yes, you're a reporter, you're a storyteller, but you're a human first, and the person you're talking to on the other end of the line, if it's on a phone call or in person sitting across from you, is also a human being, and you have to relate to them in that way first and not as a character first, because if you start thinking of people as characters, they become flat. There's this inherent separation between you and them, and that kind of cuts off your empathetic powers and your compassion. And I've really come to believe in story, in the purpose of story in general. And so I think it's worth it, again, as long as other people agree to have you tell their story, it's worth it, because the reason I do this isn't because it's necessarily lucrative. It's because I feel like, I've tapped into something that is connected to the gifts that I bring to this world, the particular being that I am, the particular storytelling that I know that I can do. There's a lot of beautiful storytellers, but you are ultimately the storyteller that you are, and you have to trust in story as a medium, as a way to connect to the human condition and to connect people to human experiences outside of what they've done. So it's really important, even when there's tragedy involved, when there's something hard to write about, to talk about, to ask somebody to relive, it serves a larger purpose, and I really believe that it's so worth it.
Yeah, that's really well put, and I think it's just, it's great hearing reporters and journalists like yourself and how you think through that. As I think the more and more you do it, the more and more you have to really think about the fairness and the trust aspect of it. That these are people and not just information wells for our extraction.
Right. Absolutely. And, with this particular story, there are two people who are killed in a ballooning event, and an important and prestigious one. And the thing about the ballooning community, this is true of many communities, is that they're so close. They're very, very close knit group of people. And so it wasn't like just two competitors died. I mean, this is two people that dozens, scores, hundreds of people love and know really well. And, it wasn't just a couple of people also in the air with them who are their best friends who are affected by this. It's an entire community. And, when I've talked to people now, years later, and even when I've shared this story, I mean, it still hurts for people to remember that and relive that. But at the same time, it's an emotional catharsis for them. And I feel that they appreciate it, and they've told me they have.
And a little while ago, too, you were just talking about reference to organizing things. And the more and more I'm doing this show, the more and more I find people are real interested in how writers organize their shit. And it's so best to access it for when it comes to writing. And so extending that to you, Nick, how do you organize your work as you settle down to write?
A combination of intentionality and haphazard BSing my way through it. But I think, where I start is I just have a folder on my desktop, and everything goes into that. I have separate folders for each person that I speak with, and that contains, audio files and transcripts, things they've shared with me. The one thing I really think has been so crucial for me in this story and in others I've told is I always create a document of chronology. even if I'm not telling the story exactly chronologically, this story is, I would say, largely chronological with a little bit of bouncing around between perspectives, but I really need to make sure that I have a solid handle on the chronology. So I create a document, and I'll make it as the span of time that covers the story kind of as big as I have access to, but I really focus on the span of the story that I'm actually telling. And so I write everything down when it happened, and then in a story like this where things are taking place, in some cases on like an hourly basis, I really get pretty detailed in that. And that becomes a really important reference because some of these timestamps and dates are so scattered throughout all my different resources and people I've talked to. And so that's probably one of the most crucial things that I have. But otherwise, I just, as much as makes sense to my brain, I just organize my notes. And, I always have another document of sort of a cast and sources document with contacts and who people are and how they relate to one another, that sort of thing. And then a document full of just random notes and links to, maybe old newspaper archives or what have you.
And a lot of people have, for their own personal taste, their favorite part of the process being like, some people just eat up the reporting and other people like that's agony, but they really like the writing and vice versa. And just for you, where do you feel most alive and engaged in this whole morass, this whole process?
This might sound a little glib, but honestly, I love whatever part I'm doing right now. Whatever moment I'm in, like I really truly love all aspects of the process. When I'm reaching out to people and talking to people and really discovering the story, that's so exciting. And I love that. And I'm not inherently a phone talker, but like I kind of have to become that. And I do love talking to people. So that's really fun for me. Discovering the story, it's like, I think I referenced earlier, like you're learning the story, you're courting it almost like a lover, and you're getting to know it, and it's really exciting. So I love that. Also, when I'm writing, I love the writing. Like it's daunting, especially when you have the blank screen with the cursor flashing in front of you, but that doesn't worry me too much either. And I really love translating what's in me onto the page. And I'll answer that question in a different way. The one thing that I really don't like is transcribing interviews. It's and it's so time consuming, but also it's so important for me. Like I do occasionally, I don't even really want to admit this, I occasionally use the AI thing when it's like a super tangential, not really important conversation, but I know I want the words in front of me. I'll do that. I do also, if I am not going to do it myself, I prefer actual other humans, and so I'll send it off to a transcription service, specifically Carol Lee Kidd transcription service. If anybody wants to check her out, they do really good work. But how
much is that, like, typically cost-wise?
Oh gosh, I don't remember off the top of my head. I want to say let's say $1 a minute roughly, but definitely approachable. And again, I never do that for my most central conversations because it's so important for me to hear things again, that I catch things that I missed the first time as I'm just in the conversation and maybe like thinking of my next comment or imagining the scene in front of me, and I kind of miss words here and there. So I kind of rediscover when I'm transcribing, and then it really reinforces that knowledge and puts it into my brain in a solid way. So it's super important, but so time consuming, and I don't love the actual action of it.
The worst is when you're going through your transcripts, and I tend to use Otter, and then I go through. I used to do it faster, but I go at 1x speed to like clean it up, and to me that still takes a long time, and I am hearing everything, but I don't have to risk the carpal tunnel syndrome of the typing constantly. And the worst is when you're going through a transcript and you're like, damn it, why didn't I follow up there? Like that was a good point to get them to expand more. And that you don't have like endless time to go back to these people because they're, as I've experienced, sometimes they might die or
right.
Yeah, like if you're working with like older people, but hell, even younger people too, you never know. But but they're also like their patience with each successive phone call starts to get eroded away, and you're like, oh God, like I have nothing more to say to you. Why do you keep calling me?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I definitely make notes as I'm transcribing too, and I'm like, yeah, follow up on that. I didn't ask and should have. I wasn't paying attention. And it's funny you mentioned, I shouldn't say funny, but that you mentioned, the possibility of people dying while you're reporting.
Yeah.
There's another story I was working on some years ago, and I don't mean this to sound humorous, but it's just like one of those absurd things that I spoke to someone. I had an opportunity to do a really long, in-depth phone call, but I was like, no, let's talk in person. I'll drive up to Colorado. We'll hang out for a couple of days and all that. And a couple of days later, he died. And
yeah,
I was kind of blown away, but that's what happened. Same story, a different guy. I ended up talking to central to the story. I talked to him. I did actually do a phone call and recorded it. And then I think I called him one more time, and then again, he died. So it's like, I don't know if I should keep going with this story.
yeah,
It's dangerous for me to tell it, apparently. So
yeah. Nick
yeah,
Davidson, the angel of death. Yeah,
it's a strange thing. Yeah, I don't. So get what you can while you can.
for sure. And as you've been doing this for several years, what would you identify as something that you're much better at today than you were 5 years ago or even 10 years ago?
That's a good question. I think I'm better at trusting myself. I know I've mentioned that earlier, but it really is huge for me, trusting myself, trusting my intuition. Even more important than that, trusting the story. I've come to believe that, like I've sort of referred to this earlier, but like I've come to believe in the story itself as like an entity, and I'm a storyteller and it's a story, and we usually think of hunting stories and looking for ideas, but I kind of feel like it's the other way around. Like stories hunt the storyteller. And I'm just prey, and like before I know it, I'm shot with an arrow and this thing has grabbed me. And then, to kind of change the metaphor a bit, then you kind of do this courtship, and so I've come to trust the story, like what the story has, and I don't mean to get like weird about it, but the story chooses the storyteller as its channel to be birthed into the world. So when a story grabs me and chooses me, I trust that. I've gotten a lot better at that, but practically speaking, I've gotten a lot better at pitching, because I understand myself as a writer and how I want to present what I know about the story, and I feel like I better understand how to just give everything I have to it without making it super long and overloading the editor. But so just really going for it and knowing exactly what elements I want in a pitch to make it kind of unavoidably interesting. I'm a better writer. The more you write, the more you read, the better you can write. Even in this story, I'm a better writer now than I was 6 months ago, just because I worked on this story with Jonah Ogle's help. Like he's amazing. I'm better now. And I think I'm also better, more comfortable at interviewing. And like I said, I kind of, I know what I want to know. I'm more light on my feet, just kind of letting a conversation go where it goes, letting those things that you didn't know to ask for surprise you, rather than kind of being rigid with a list of questions, and just kind of having a natural conversation, trusting that flow. It's kind of like Bruce Lee, when he created his new martial art, Jeet Kune Do. One of his principles was there are no fixed stances. So don't be rigidly in a certain position. Be light on your feet. Don't be, even as a human, as a martial artist, but also as a storyteller, don't be caught on your heels. Just like let yourself adapt to the moment and what's needed with this particular story.
And I love that element of how the story chooses you. And I think embedded in that, and this comes with time and maturity, is like early on, there is such a hustle to want to get traction, to make a name for yourself. And it's easy to be impatient. And ultimately, like, you really need to surrender and have a certain measure of patience to learn, to get those skills, and to have maybe and to leave yourself open to a story, finding the right storyteller. And that can be it's such a wise way of thinking about it. And I really love that ethos. But man, it can be really hard to surrender to that, especially when you're just like really maybe struggling to get that toehold that we all so desperately want.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, patience and surrender are really so key. And the other thing is, talking about success is, I've struggled with this myself, is comparing yourself to other writers and saying,
Big
why
time.
am I not at X place right now? And the answer to that is because you're not that person. It's your journey, as a writer, as a human, isn't about them. So what you can do is look to other people who are having success, people you admire, and celebrate them. To an extent, I think that any human being's success is all human success. So don't get beaten down and discouraged by someone else coming out with an amazing story that you didn't happen to do. I mean, get over it. Find your story. It's like I feel like nature doesn't make copies, only originals, and so everybody is original. There's never been a Nick Davidson before me. There's never been a Brendan O'Meara before you. So nobody who's alive today, no human who has ever been alive in human history, can tell you how to be successful in your way. Only you have that map inside of yourself to figure out how to be the storyteller that you are.
Absolutely. Well, Nick, as you know, I love bringing these conversations down for a landing by asking a recommendation for some kind for the listeners out there, and that's just anything you're excited about. So I just posed that to you. What are you excited about that you'd want to share with the listeners?
So many things, but I'll say, so there's another podcast that I've been listening to for years called Living Myth Podcast. And it's the mythologist and storyteller Michael Mead, and it's really beautiful. He uses ancient myths, these most enduring human stories, as a lens to understand the modern world that we live in today, which is a crazy place. There's a lot of things to orient oneself to in these times, but although these times are unique in the specific way that they're unique, the human elements of them have been repeated over and over throughout history. This idea of like the collapse of society, for example. I would recommend listening to that. Really not only got me through, but really helped me mentally, psychologically, spiritually thrive in the midst of the COVID pandemic when that started and ever since. So yeah, just this using old stories and the wisdom of the ancient and modern poets and trying to figure out and orient to this modern world. So that I think is something worth checking out. Good. And also just, touch the earth, like that, connect with nature. That's super important in my life. And I'm really blessed to have great, easy access to nature and to true wilderness living here in Santa Fe. And I know a lot of people don't have that, but whatever form of nature you've got, like sit by a tree, breathe in the forest, center yourself. Like that's so crucial to my well-being. So I recommend that.
Oh, I love it. Well, Nick, this was awesome. I'm so glad that we're able to touch base and talk about this incredible story you did for the Atavist and how you approach the work, which I think is really, really singular and inspiring. So just thanks for carving out some time and talking shop.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. I really appreciate you having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes. Awesome. Wasn't that great? That was great. I thought it was great. Thanks to Jonah. Thanks to Atavist for continued partnership. I don't take it for granted. Magazine.atavist.com. Go subscribe. Thanks to Nick Davidson, nickgdavidson.com website, at Nick G. Davidson on Instagram. Great stuff. Like I said, no parting shot. This episode ran a little long. I'm going to save that for another time. So that's where we're at. All right? Good. Very nice. Stay wild, CNFers. And if you can do, interview. See ya.